I'm writing this because my family won't talk about it anymore. I'm the only one who can't seem to forget. I was raised on the outskirts of Preston, a small town in southern Idaho with a population of around 5,000. My more immediate community was an isolated dead-end dirt road called Bear Creek. Less than 20 families lived on the Bear Creek. I didn't mind being so isolated. I grew up in the comfort of wide fields and close neighbors that only rural people know. We were a Mormon community, very church-centered, very community-centered. All the young girls, myself included, were part of the young women's group, and all of the boys were members of the local Boy Scout troop, which doubled as a church group in our area. We had 4th of July parties at the local ballpark and swam in the nearby reservoir. It was a good, quiet community. My house, a 92-year-old farmhouse built by my great-great-grandfather, was situated on a small hill surrounded by a wide grass field on one side and a snaking dirt road on the other. Across the road was the creek bottoms. Southern Idaho is categorized in a desert climate, so not much grows outside of the irrigated fields besides sagebrush and burrs. The creek bottoms were the exception. The creek fed the growth of a thick tangle of pussy willow bushes. In the late fall, we used to go down into the bottoms and pick the white, cottony pussy willow seeds to decorate the fences of our driveway. Being so isolated, it wasn't uncommon for animals to come down from the mountains. We had a female moose who brought her calf down and lived in our orchard every winter. And the occasional lion wasn't unheard of either. The summer when I turned 8, I remember because it was the same year as my baptism, a smaller mountain lion was spotted several times in our area. We weren't worried. The big cats stayed away from the farms and usually moved on when the area didn't yield enough food. The same summer, my neighbor Peyton was working on his Eagle Scout project. He loved National Geographic and thought it would be pretty cool to try putting together a National Geographic submission on our little creek bottoms. The young lion that happened to be in our area at the same time made him especially excited. He decided he wanted to try and get pictures of the lion and emailed the National Geographic team for advice. They recommended setting up an automatic camera that takes shots every couple of seconds in an area the lion was known to visit. They also recommended setting some kind of bait so the lion was more likely to come by. No one in the creek liked the idea of live bait or carry-on, so we came up with a different kind of bait. We decided to set up an audio recording of a dying rabbit and play it on a loop through a set of speakers hidden in the willows. I remember when everyone was down in the bottoms testing the speakers, and I heard the noise for the first time. The sound of a dying rabbit is horrible. It's been described as being almost identical to the sound of a screaming child. If you've never heard it yourself, there's plenty of recordings available online. It's worth a listen. The camera was set up. The speakers were set up. Everything was perfect. Peyton explained that he would allow the camera and recording to play uninterrupted for a week, and then he would go check on it. This would give time for our scent to fade from the bottoms and encourage the lion to come closer. At first I was worried about the noise. It was a truly horrible noise, and our house was the closest to the setup point in the bottoms. My father assured me that the noise wouldn't reach as far as our house, and I was relieved when we arrived home that night and he was correct. The bottoms were far enough away that I couldn't hear anything. I remember Peyton the next day at church. He was fidgety and excited to check on the equipment, but he had to wait a week, which everybody kept reminding him. He couldn't risk going down too early and scaring the lion away for good. That night I woke up to an awful noise. I sat ramrod straight in my bed with my eyes wide in the dark. Hands clutched so hard my palms bore the indent of my fingernails for hours after. I knew that noise. It was the recording of the rabbit. It sounded faint and far off, like it really could have been coming from the bottoms. But that was impossible, because the recording had been going all night the previous day and I hadn't heard a thing. I didn't sleep that night. I was too scared to get out of bed and wake my parents. The recording played over and over again. I had the loop memorized. In the morning, I stumbled into the kitchen for breakfast. My mom and dad were sitting at the kitchen table. They too had dark rings under their eyes. I hadn't been the only one who'd heard it. Mom was convinced that the equipment must have been broken. She wanted to go down into the bottoms to check it out. Dad refused. He was a kind, gentle man and didn't want to stir up any unnecessary drama. He was sure there had been a strong wind last night, and the wind was carrying the noise farther than its natural reach. He told us to listen. We did. He was right, we couldn't hear it now. We forgot about it and went about our daily goings. The next night it happened again. I stayed up in bed with my back to the wall. The screaming was even louder than before, but this time something was different. It was lower pitched than I remember, and parts of the loop were slowed down, as if the recording were warped in places. At times the loop did not loop naturally, and instead picked up at a random place in the middle. My mom didn't mention anything at the breakfast table, but both her and my dad seemed tense. The third night I mustered the courage to stand beside my bedroom window and look out into the yard. For a moment I stood, rooted to the spot, my hands shaking no matter how hard I clenched them. The noise sidled in through the cracks in the window. I watched the outline of the trees in the yard, perfectly still. Not even the slightest breeze stirred their branches. My mom announced that she would be going to visit her sisters in town the next day, and would probably spend the night there. She invited me to come along, but I was a daddy's girl at heart and chose to stay at the farm. I took Mom's place beside Dad in their bed that night, but even that didn't help. I don't think my dad was asleep either, for he was unnaturally still the whole night. We began to hear the noise during the day too. I was drawing with chalk on the sidewalk when it happened. My shoulders tensed and the hairs on the back of my neck prickled. There was only one scream, a short, high-pitched one. And then the recording fell silent. It happened again several times throughout the day, but never the whole loop, just clips from it. Later that evening, Peyton's dad came up the driveway on his four-wheeler. He said he was looking for their dog, a sweet yellow lab who had been missing since that morning. Dad said he was sorry, and that we hadn't seen her. I stared at him, silently begging him to mention the recording, but he didn't. He was a quiet man after all. He didn't want to bring up any unnecessary drama. Mom stayed away the whole week. Dad and I didn't sleep. By Saturday, the screaming could be heard constantly, though it seemed to have deviated from the familiar loop entirely. I didn't recognize any of it. Sometimes the screams were thin and long. Other times, they were hardly more than growls. Once, while my dad had been heating up meatloaf for lunch, the noise rose into such a rancorous din that he dropped the plate and it shattered. I pressed my hands over my ears where I sat at the table and squeezed my eyes shut, but it didn't help. The noise forced its way in through the cracks of my fingers and pinched my throat and rattled in my rib cage. The din lasted for a whole minute, then fell silent. Dad was shaking. That was the last we heard of the noise that day. Peyton came by Saturday evening to ask permission to cross our road to collect the equipment. He was so excited. I watched him disappear into the creek bottoms with a sense of tired relief. After the equipment was gone, it would all stop. I couldn't wait to get a full night's sleep. Not a minute later, I spotted Peyton coming back up from the creek. I was confused. It had taken us much longer to set up the camera and speakers, so I'd only assumed it would take just as long to collect them. My breath stilled when Peyton came closer. He didn't look right. His eyes were wide and his face pale. Something wet dribbled from his chin and onto his shirt. I later realized it was vomit. My dad caught him before he fell and demanded to know what had happened. Peyton couldn't speak, he just cried. We called his dad. I looked after Peyton as both my dad and his dad went into the bottoms. They were gone a long time. When they returned, their faces were grim, and they smelled funny. I noticed red on my dad's hands. I asked what was wrong, but they brushed right past me and immediately called the police. Nobody would tell me what had happened. I sat on the couch as a blur of neighbors and police officers swirled around me. At one point, an officer placed something on the kitchen table and left. I looked into the kitchen curiously. It was the camera from the bottoms. I wish I hadn't looked. The camera was a little banged up. Tiny scratches and dents covered the plastic casing. When I lifted it, my hand stuck to the plastic. Something tacky and odorous covered the screen, but it turned on fine. The first set of photos were normal. Just the pussy willows cast green in the glow of the night setting. As I continued to click through them, they quickly became strange. At one point the camera angle changed, as if the camera had been knocked from its post. Grass now obscured most of the frame. Flecks of red appeared on the lens and remained for the rest of the sets. One photo made me pause. There was a figure in this one, or half of a figure, as most of the upper torso hadn't made it into the frame. I thought it could be human, but it didn't look like it should be standing upright. Its legs were twisted like an animal, and it seemed to be having difficulty supporting itself in an upright position. Beside the legs, a long, thin arm hung. Whatever it was must have been stooped over, for its fingertips hung below its crooked knees. The next set was different. It was as if the camera had been picked up and was now being held. The first photo was of the bottoms at night. The next startled me. I had to look closely before deciding what it was. A rabbit had been laid in the bushes, but its ears and most of its scalp had been peeled away. The next was of the same rabbit, but a thin dark hand was holding it up against the sky. Its limp body hung like something from a nightmare. In the following photos, more rabbits joined the one, each with their ears and scalp removed. Then a cat. Then more cats. Then a dog, the yellow lab. Then the lion. The following photo was of 7 rabbits, 3 cats, 1 dog, and the lion all laid out in a row, facing the same way. Their arms and legs had been arranged as if they were marching, like some parade. All of their scalps had been removed and tiny white glints of their skulls could be seen. The last photo was overly bright, like the photo had been taken too close with the flash on. An eye dominated the frame, but it was yellowed and crusty and had a bar pupil like a horse. In the bottom corner, the edge of a mouth could be seen. No lips, just teeth. Sharp and little, with wide gaps of red gum between them. I wish I hadn't looked. I heard my dad talking to the police outside. They said the speakers had malfunctioned. The recording had only played the first night. My town is one of those backcountry, middle-of-nowhere places in which word-of-mouth folklore and wild superstition defines its population. It's the kind of place a visitor might hear ethereal music in the woods, or catch a glimpse of an out-of-place animal roaming the empty fields. If your senses are attuned to such things, then you might even notice strange graves carved into the slopes of gullies, or old ropes tied to the limbs of withered trees, their trunks riddled with bullet holes. But we know of something else. Ineffable horrors dwelling in the depths of an abandoned, isolated coal mine. Local legend tells of a pit, a dark place in which some 300 miners lost their lives in a colliery disaster over a century ago. So the story goes, a number of miners had complained about the perilous conditions in the mine on several occasions, many citing bad omens, including the presence of carrion crows in the subterranean depths, and some even claiming to hear the unlikely neighing of startled horses in the ghastly myriad passageways. But the miners' pleas went unheard, resulting in the catastrophic explosion that led directly to their deaths. Whispers exchanged over an ale at the Painter's Greyhound tell of survivors, starving miners entombed in the labyrinthine tunnels, honeycombing the cold earth beneath our town. Occasionally the ground opens up and swallows things, dilapidated sheds, and the corners of houses. Sometimes people. Fodder for the ravenous miners. And pets abandon their owners, dogs disappearing into shadowy recesses, and cats straying deep into the wilderness, never to be seen again. As the saying goes here in my town, all victims of the pit. The location of the pit over the course of a century was mostly forgotten. Knowledge of the disaster itself conveniently buried by those with more pressing political and financial interests. The Audis, though, as they're known in these parts, are still in possession of memories, and often recount unsettling tales passed down through the generations. If it hadn't been for my grandfather, I, at the tender age of 14, might never have set out to find the pit that day. The route related to me was both protracted and disorienting. Seekers of the pit must first descend into the old ravine, my grandfather muttered through false teeth. A route at one time commonly frequented by my sort. Follow the oaks and the silver birches along the old trail, marked by the red bricks of Scooth's cottage, and you'll reach the Bald Hills. You know the Bonnies, don't you, boy? I nodded, for I did know the Bonnies, and still do. Unnatural rucks carved out by the long-perished miners, barren and unwelcoming, suggestive of untold mysteries and the forbidden knowledge they serve to protect. My grandfather continued, "That awkward terrain, boy, coupled with those dark ponds can lead one to Dogwood, a forested area intersected by confusing, abandoned lanes leading deep into what we call the sterile heart of the backcountry. You'll know Dogwood by the density of the underbrush, though you'll have to look closely if you want to find the accursed entrance." To this day I still don't fully understand why my grandfather encouraged me to seek it out. His warning as I left that day often returns to me on dark, foreboding autumn afternoons. "Boy, it is nothing to look, it is everything to see. See yourself and know the escape the darkness." But I was just a 14-year-old lad. How was I to know what he meant? My best friend Key knocked on my door at 7:15 a.m. that fateful October morning. We walked the length of Park Road and plunged headlong into the old ravine. The thing we sought, somehow, was already with us and was working to discourage us, descending upon the golden-brown foliage in the form of mist. We pressed on. The discovery of the silver birches was fortuitous, for beyond them we soon observed the red bricks of Scooth's derelict cottage. Moss and creeping ivy caressed the old stones joylessly, consuming what had once been the jewel of the ravine. Just like Scooth, its time had passed. The cool morning air met us as we climbed the slopes and stepped out onto Bonnies, also known as the Bald Hills. It's quite a thing to experience both the absence and evidence of man simultaneously. But that was just how it was, standing there on the old rucks, a man-made landscape, abandoned, nature working to reclaim what it once possessed. The gravelly mounds hissed at us, exposed to the brisk autumnal wind. Key and I traversed the hills hastily, avoiding the ponds, motionless bodies of water concealing horrible depths. Depths rumored to connect directly to the old tunnels, flooded passageways where the survivors were said to roam. In a moment of hesitation, we shuddered. We saw the tree line on the horizon, dense foliage forming a seemingly impenetrable wall. A cloud of mist hovered above the forest, threateningly. It whispered, "Turn back." But we didn't turn back. We happened upon that most sought-after location, Dogwood. Brushing the nettles and brambles aside, we discovered an old pathway. The tiniest amount of gravel still visible beneath the grass and weeds. Mist shielded much of what lay beyond, so we stepped onto the path and made the conscious decision to keep to it. Deeper and deeper we drove into the underbrush, working hard to clear the path of shrubbery and other hindrances, blind to the inherent dangers one should be aware of in the proximity of a disused coal mine. A capped shaft presented itself as such a danger, several rotten timber planks straddling its hideous mouth. Luck was to thank for preventing an unfortunate tumble into the blackness beneath. The remains of an old railway line brushed against our boots as we closed in on our destination. The innumerable limbs of large trees clawing at the rusty tracks zealously. Key was the first to note the change in the air, a staleness, a rancidity that had visibly affected the flora of the wood. As we neared its source, we saw fewer and fewer nettles, brambles, and ferns. Vegetation in general seemingly afraid to flourish in what my grandfather had referred to as the sterile heart of the backcountry. Withered trees stood defiantly, though the souls the roots might once have harbored had long since departed. Even the soiled gelatinous mud had been affected by the otherworldly blight. And then we saw it, the great arch, marking the entrance to the site of the pit. The arch and iron monstrosity once beheld the name of the mine, though upon our observations, the bold lettering had mostly eroded. 3 rust-nibbled letters remained, P-I-T. Trepidation begged us to flee, to return to the familiar comforts of home. The quiet town center, host to Marge's sandwich shop and Gilbert's newsagents, the ancient sprawling cemetery on Church Street, and Pollock's School for the Deaf under the willows on Grundy Street. Even the lone silhouette of Lightning Tree standing atop Broomhead's Hill was an image I would have happily traded for, that of the dark, deathly visage of deepest Dogwood. We trudged onwards until we came upon the mere, It filled us with dread. My father, a regular up at the Painter's Greyhound, said the seniors often spoke of an old mere, a pond but a stone's throw from the pit. Allegedly, the old miners used to wash their hands and faces in it, steadily darkening the water with coal. Other kids, in times gone by, who had set out in search of the mine, had happened upon the mere. Alarmed by the shade of the water, most had turned back, though some strayed too near and were never seen again. One lad, the Audis would say, caught a glimpse of something strange in the still water, and in the grip of some inexplicable mania, fled and threw himself into the pit. Witnesses, two of them, returned from the wood in a near catatonic state, claiming the lad was pulled into the mouth by dark ashen hands. The lad, like the others, was never seen again, and there was no investigation into his disappearance. The Odis say the lad was cursed, that their mere's a flexion or that their pit. That lad should have kept his eyes off both. Thee's got furt see theeself if thee wants furt live. Braver than most, Key and I approached the old mere and glared into the murky water. I swear to this day I've never seen water as dark. The face that looked back at me, a strange warped version of my own, haunts me to this day. As for Key, he offered no description of what he saw in there. Stepping away from the mere, we scanned our immediate surroundings. Beyond a smattering of withered silver birches, a trail marked by a rusty chain-linked fence led to our destination. Tentatively we approached, mindful of the eroded metal fencing poking up out of the gelatinous earth. Sharp and menacing, some 15 paces further and we were upon it. The pit, blackened charcoal-like trees loomed eerily above it, their poisoned limbs hanging limply, pointing towards the untold depths below. I still have difficulty describing it. Not in terms of its outward appearance, as quite simply it was nothing more than a hole in the ground, some 15 feet in diameter. No, it was the inexplicable sensation that gnawed at my nerve endings and tugged at my faculties. That's what I have difficulty describing. To say the urge to flee was overwhelming would be an understatement. Staring into that black abyss evoked an emotional response unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It was as though Key and I had discovered the eye of Mother Earth herself, and to look directly into it was a sin punishable by a fate worse than death. And we had been warned, the folk who fell into sinkholes, the curious kids who mysteriously disappeared, the pets that strayed too far from their owners, all victims of whatever it was that roamed those unfathomable passageways at the bottom of that accursed pit. As the eye glared up at us, my thoughts returned to that peculiar reflection I'd gazed upon in the mirror. And then there was movement below. I looked to Key and shivered. There was no conceivable way down into the pit, and as such no conceivable way up out of it. Was there? The movement came in the form of a sound, a shuffling, labored progression, the sound of frail, ashen hands clutching blindly at the roots of dead trees. As the unsettling imagery sketched itself in my mind's eye with an incredible urgency, the all-consuming rancid fetor grew in its potency, so much so that I could almost taste it, my senses utterly assaulted by it. The clamor neared the surface, threatening to make eye contact with us in a matter of moments. Key and I stood, frozen to the spot, lips cracked, throats dry, inhaling the foul odor as it crept towards us. Seekers of the pit, the two of us, sincerely regretting our inquisitiveness and impudence. As the nameless thing neared the surface, I turned and fled. Moments later, Key was at my rear. Heedless we were of the metal fragments strewn across the trail. Ignorant we were of the shadowy mere and the boggy underfoot as we raced out of dogwood. Oblivious we were of the strange absence of fauna throughout the bold hills. Unconcerned we were, as once again we plunged into the old ravine, passing Scooth's cottage and the silver birches. Thrilled we were, as we made it to the safety of Park Road, gasping and collapsing to the merciful tarmac of a familiar thoroughfare. As Key and I walked home, not a single word was exchanged. Key and I attended school together the following day, but neither of us discussed the pit. That was our unspoken agreement, both secretly terrified, afraid that spoken acknowledgement of the thing we both knew was out there would confirm it, invite it back into our lives. But our pact didn't last. It should have lasted till the end of our days. We bumped into each other some 5 years later at the bar in the Painter's Greyhound, on a dreary autumn evening. The memories spilled out of us, and though several Audis were eavesdropping, none of them had a word to say. Like the church steeple at the heart of our town, one memory stood out above the rest. A memory the both of us had attributed to the sordid weaving of a nightmare or folie à deux. There, in the quiet pub, we described the strange sounds and the hideous fear we sensed in that instant before we took flight. But as I spoke of the moment I turned and fled, Key spoke of something else, something deplorable. From out of the pit had emerged the ashen hands and charcoal face of a long-dead miner. He claimed the very same face had replaced his reflection in the mirror. Its empty eyes studied him, and as it pointed a pallid finger in his direction, it whispered, "We are coming." It was with those fateful words Key had turned and fled. At the bar his face fell, the color running out of it completely. He looked up at me. "They're coming for me," he muttered. "I know it." The next day I received a telephone call. I recognized the caller as Daniel Tately, Key's younger brother. Daniel was morose, his voice but a whisper at the end of the line. There had been an incident at the Tately bungalow, one involving a sinkhole. I shuddered at the implications. The family had awoken in the early hours of the morning to a series of tremendous crashing sounds. Daniel and his parents, the latter of whom still refused to discuss the incident, rushed to Key's bedroom, flung the door open and stood aghast as their son, brother, and my friend was dragged, kicking and screaming, into a gaping hole. Malnourished, ashen hands clutching his head and arms. All this, Daniel muttered in hushed tones. He spoke of Key's paranoia in the weeks leading up to the incident, an apparent preoccupation with the subterranean mines beneath our town, fears relating to the distant muffled sound of pickaxes, and the latent idea that a nameless thing from the heart of the mines had spent 5 long years searching for him. In his mind's eye he had watched as it traversed the flooded depths, clearing collapsed corridors, looking for the precise location in which to dig hundreds of feet upwards. And he had listened as the encroaching clamor fueled his imagination, coupled with what Daniel referred to as an odor, an overpowering fetor that even the family had noticed in the days leading up to the incident. "It got him," Daniel said. And it had. The pit, the occupants of the pit. Life in my town carries on. The few of us who remember such horrors exchange our tales in whispers over quiet ales in the Painter's Greyhound on chilly autumnal nights. Occasionally I revisit that fateful moment Key and I gazed into that old mirror. I saw myself, Key saw something else. As my grandfather once said, "Boy, 'tis nothing to look, 'tis everything to see. See yourself and know thee escape the darkness." Now finally, I know what he meant. There are things in this world, dark things. Things that the mind cannot fully process, and so it blocks it out, or fills in the gaps. Things that terrify us to our deepest foundations. These things are the reason that humanity fears the darkness. Because the dark is where these things dwell, where they thrive. And there are people who deny that those things are real. That something so terrifying can exist on the same plane as we do. These people are blind fools. I know this because I have seen one of these horrible things, and I was lucky to survive the experience. My friend and my brother, however, were not. It happened the summer that I turned 17. My brother Tanner and I had planned a camping trip up north at our grandfather's old hunting cabin. The old man had left it to our father when he died several years back, and even though our relationship with dear old Dad wasn't the best after he and Mom's divorce, we loved the old cabin. We spent at least one weekend up there every summer. It was in a gorgeous wooded area that we had been exploring since we were little. So we were planning to go spend the weekend up there. Just me, my brother, and our childhood best friend Anna. If I had known then what I know now, I would have vetoed the whole thing so hard it would make their heads spin. But you know what they say about hindsight. So that Friday we packed all of our gear into my brother's beat-up pickup and left for the cabin. It took us a 4-hour drive to get up to the place, but it was so worth it. By mid-afternoon we were unpacking the essentials and getting ready to go fishing out at the old creek about a mile back in the woods. It was on the way out to the creek that we found what would later turn out to be the first sign of something being seriously wrong. Tanner was a few yards ahead of me and Anna as we were quietly chatting. He stopped and called back to us, his gaze on something off the side of the somewhat overgrown trail. "Hey Sarah, Anna, come see this." He pointed to whatever had caught his attention. We stopped talking and caught up to him. I followed his pointing hand out to a lump of something laying in the tall grass. I squinted and looked closer. It was a deer, a dead, rotted-out corpse of a doe. It had been there for some time because there wasn't even the smell of rotting meat to accompany the poor dead creature. "You," Anna said, a little disgust in her voice. My curiosity was piqued, though. "I'm going to check it out," I stated, settling my fishing pole against a tree and the tackle box beside it. I stepped through the tall grass and a couple of sticker bushes, approaching the deer. See, I collected the skills of different animals. I already had 2 buck skills, antlers and all, but I didn't have a doe. As I came around the corpse, I found something interesting. All of its insides were gone. Not slowly decomposed into the ground, but completely gone. I noticed something on the doe's exposed ribs. I looked closer. All along the ribs and other bones there were teeth marks. A shiver ran down my spine, but I ignored it. I thought that the doe must have died and a coyote or some other scavenger had found its body and made a good meal of it. Even the skull had scrapes and gouges from birds pecking at it, so it was useless to me. I didn't bother looking closer by. I should have. "Find anything for your creepy-ass bone collection?" Tanner asked as I stepped back onto the trail. "Nah, something got at it already. There are marks all over the bones," I told him as I picked up my fishing gear. We continued on to the lake after that, all thoughts of the deer going out of my head. For the rest of the day, up until the sun started to set, we sat on the bank of the creek, fishing. Tanner and I had gotten into a friendly competition to see who could catch more fish. Anna won. We headed back to the cabin, Anna carrying the cooler full of live fish. The whole way back I had this creepy feeling on the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I just ignored it, thinking it was nothing. By the time we got back to the cabin, it was getting pretty dark, so we put the fish cooler in the truck bed and headed inside. We had a fire in the fireplace, and our sleeping bags set up on the old camp cots in no time. We had a dinner of fire-roasted hot dogs and pork and beans from a can. The whole time we were joking back and forth, and at one point, we even devolved into throwing bits of charred hot dog at each other. By the time we went to bed, it was pretty late. We were all tired. I'm pretty sure we all passed out pretty quick. I know that one minute I was snuggling into my sleeping bag, and the next it was lights out. I started awake sometime later. I don't know what woke me up, but whatever it was had the hair on the back of my neck standing up. I lay there for a few minutes, listening hard. At first all I heard was Anna's soft breathing, and Tanner's muffled snoring over in the corner. Then I heard it. There was something moving around outside. I could hear it shuffling through the grass and pawing at the ground. After a minute, it seemed to fade away. I relaxed, figuring that it was a stray dog or a coyote. I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I was woken up to the sound of Tanner yelling outside. I jerked awake and scrambled out of my sleeping bag, tripping over a disoriented Anna, who was attempting the same thing in the process. We both managed to untangle ourselves and make it out the door in time to see my brother throwing a piece of broken plastic into the big trash can we kept up here. It was a piece of our broken fish cooler. There were pieces of it strewn around the back of the truck, and what was left of it sat on the ground by the truck. The lid was gone, and chunks had been taken out of the side. There was a large puddle of water that had soaked into the ground, making it a muddy mess around the cooler. Of the fish there was nothing left but bloodstains and a few bits of torn flesh and bone. It clicked that whatever had woken me up last night had probably been the culprit. Seeing how the cooler was completely destroyed, that meant it was most likely a bear. and the huge footprints that were all over the mud seemed to add to that theory. So we all helped clean up the mess, and then went to have breakfast. After we finished eating and cleaning up from breakfast, we decided we were going to go for a hike. It was decided that we would stick together, since the bear may still be in the vicinity. So we all got dressed and ready to go hiking up the trail behind the house. I got dressed in my favorite dark gray cargos, a blue tank top. I had my gray hoodie tied around my waist and my well-loved hiking boots on. A few months back, there had been a safety thing at school, and all of us had decided that we would wear something neon, just in case we got separated. My color was neon yellow, so I had a neon yellow hat on, my blonde ponytail sticking out the back. Anna had in a pair of black joggers leggings with neon orange reflective stripes down the side and a matching jacket over an orange tank top printed with a large rainbow owl. And my brother was wearing his own cargos in dark green with a bright blue hoodie. He had a reflective blue armband and a blue hat to match. We all packed a backpack with trail snacks, bottled water, a few other useful things, and our own emergency kits. The kits were another product of the safety course. They contained an LED flashlight each with extra batteries, waterproof matches, an emergency knife with a whistle, a compass, and a small mirror in the handle. All set, we headed up the mountain. About an hour in, we made it to a spot that we all liked. It was an outcropping of rock that had enough space for us to sit down and enjoy a snack. The view here was incredible. After we rested and caught our breath, we kept going. It was around 3 p.m. when we made it up to the spot we usually hike to. It was a spot next to the creek where there was a set of small waterfalls that dropped down into a small pool before narrowing out and flowing down the mountain to the spot we liked fishing. Usually we would stay for a while and enjoy the view, but today there was a nasty surprise waiting for us. As we parted the trees and stepped into the clearing, we were all hit with the smell of something dead that had just begun to decompose. Laying next to the creek was the half-eaten body of a raccoon. It was turned so that we could just see its insides spilling onto the ground. Its little face was turned towards us, its eyes swollen and bulging. Anna turned and retched into the brush at the edge of the clearing. Tanner made a disgusted sound, and I turned away, unable to stand the sight. As soon as Anna was able to control her heaving stomach, we all three turned and headed back down the mountain without a word. We were halfway back to the rock outcropping, the sun just starting to set to the left of us, when we heard something out in the trees. It was shuffling around and it seemed to be following us. Wordlessly, we all picked up the pace. We didn't stop at our rock, we just headed straight back to the cabin. Our follower was still there. We could hear it crunching through the underbrush, tracking us all the way down the mountain. It was almost dark by now. At this point, we were all pretty scared. Anna and I were holding hands, while Tanner rushed us along ahead of him. He had pulled his knife from his bag and had it ready. We made it to the trailhead and around the back of the cabin. We made it to the door just in time. Whatever had been following a distance behind us broke the cover of the trees and was sprinting around the cabin in. Anna was already inside and I was stepping through the door when Tanner shoved me into the room and slammed the door shut behind him. He dropped the bar that served as a lock into place and braced his back against it. We were all scared out of our wits, but I think we all almost pissed ourselves in sheer terror when the thing on the other side of the door scratched against it and let out a high-pitched whine. It pawed the door again a few times before it gave up. We heard it retreat, but none of us moved for what felt like hours, but was probably just a few minutes. Anna was the first to move, getting up from where she had been sitting against the wall with her knees drawn up to her chest. She slowly shifted up and peeked out the lone window. I really wish she hadn't. She dropped to the ground again quickly, tears of pure terror streaming down her face. She mouthed something at my brother and I. Wolf. There was a wolf outside waiting. She slowly crawled over to us. Her blue eyes were wide and filled with fear. She hugged me and I held her, feeling her shaking like a leaf. "It's a huge wolf," she whispered, "and it's staring right at the door, just sitting there watching." She started sobbing. I held her and shushed her crying. Tanner wrapped his arms around us both and laid his head on my shoulder. We sat there, all of us, scared to death and shaking. None of us dared move. We hadn't heard it leave, so we all knew that it was still there, watching, waiting for us. It was then that I realized that it had been there all along. It had been watching us from the first day, and it had been what had gotten at the fish, and now it was after us. A chill ran through me at the realization. No sooner than I thought that then, an unearthly howl split the air. It was loud enough that the widow rattled and we all had to cover our ears. Hot tears pricked my eyes. I was so afraid in that moment that seemed to last an eternity. Anna's scream shattered the moment, this being the last straw for her. Fear lanced through me again, a fresh wave of icy terror. I don't quite remember exactly what happened next, just that suddenly she was up and running to hide, and then there was a horrible shriek as the wolf tore through the door. Tanner was dragged back and out of my arms, screaming, and the sound of snarling and growling followed. Something hot and wet splattered over my back and I fell, trying desperately to claw my way under the cabinet where the firewood was kept. Then it was back and tearing through the door. It slammed into me, and a white-hot pain tore through my shoulder as its teeth sunk into me. In that moment I could perceive everything. Its weight on my back, huge paws holding me down and cracking 2 of my ribs, blood pouring from my shoulder. Its teeth buried in my flesh, muscle and bones, and the putrid scent of its breath like something long dead and rotting. And then it was gone. All I felt was agony. I could distantly hear someone screaming, but it seemed so far away. I think I passed out then, for a moment anyway. The next thing I knew was being dragged across the floor by my pant leg. There was something shiny in my field of vision, and in my delirious state I reached out and wrapped my fingers around it. A knife, my brother's knife, and just like that, everything snapped back into place. My grip tightened on the hilt of the knife and I turned. The wolf had me by the leg, dragging me to the door. There was blood everywhere, and Anna lay across the room, her body torn apart. She was already dead. I reared up and slashed the knife down at the monster that had a hold of me. The knife arched down and sunk into a huge golden eye. The wolf dropped me and I yanked the knife free as the beast backed away, whipping its head from side to side. I scrambled to my feet and lunged forward, furious. I slashed at the beast over and over, stabbing and slashing, driving it back. It yelped when the blade connected. I kept slashing, fury and fear, both driving my hand until the blade lodged in the creature's neck and snapped free of the hilt. The monster wolf fell, eyes locked on me, wheezing and gurgling as blood poured out of its ruined eye and a few other wounds. I dropped to my knees, panting. The thing that had been hunting us since we arrived dropped, and its breathing slowed as its lifeblood poured from close to a dozen deep wounds, until finally, with one last rattle, it breathed no more. I curled in on myself, the fear of moments ago being replaced with a deep sadness and pain. The beast was dead, but so was my brother and my best friend. I let out a low moan, tears running renewed down my blood-stained cheeks. And then the world went black. I woke up in the hospital. It turned out that when we hadn't called our parents that night, as we promised we would, they had called the police. The 2 officers had driven up to the cabin and found my brother, completely torn apart, out front. And they had found Anna's body and me in the cabin. I was barely alive. I had lost a lot of blood from the attack. But the police officer who had explained everything to me had asked me something that made my blood run cold. He asked me who the man that had been found in the cabin with us, stabbed to death, had been. I told him I didn't know. They released me from the hospital a few days later. I never went back up to the cabin. I'm too afraid to face what happened there, too afraid to face what I have become. There are nights that I dream of running in the moonlight, hunting down poor defenseless creatures and sinking my teeth into their flesh, their blood sweet and tangy on my tongue. There are nights that I wake up, covered head to toe in dirt and grass, and blood, the taste of copper in my mouth. So now I believe in the things that live in darkness, horrible things that send you fleeing in terror, and I know that they are real. I know because now I am one of them. and I fear the night that I dream of hunting down some poor person and tearing into them. I fear it more than anything, and I fear the day that I don't fear it anymore. The day that I become a real monster,